Friends, it's so inspiring to be with you today, and we are so grateful that you are here. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our 172nd online gathering for faith leaders across the country. This regular gathering is called Courageous Leadership, and it's sponsored by ELCA's coaching ministry. I'm Jill Beverlin. I use the pronoun she, her, and I am the Director of Coaching Ministries for the ELCA, and blessed to be one of your facilitators today. So continuing our connection with the truth and healing movement of the ELCA, I would like to offer a land acknowledgement. I am speaking with you from a place located on the Fox River in Appleton, Wisconsin. This area is the ancestral homelands of 5 nations of Native Indigenous peoples: the Menominee tribe, the Ho-Chunk Winnebago tribe, the Potawatomi tribe, the Oneida tribe, and the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohicans and the Brothertown community. I honor and respect the diverse Indigenous peoples connected to this land on which I live. Expanding this, we are each gathered in this virtual space from all parts of Turtle Island. Because we understand that all land is Indigenous land, I now invite each of you to name in the chat the Indigenous peoples or tribal nations who were the first to care for the lands and places where you are located. Along with this, it is important that we acknowledge all of our Indigenous siblings who continue to care for this land and call it their home. And if you are Indigenous, we invite you to name your people or tribal nation in the chat feature now so that we may see you more fully in this virtual space. Thank you, friends, for engaging this. So through these gatherings, we have developed a covenant of how we enter and interact in this space. We are committed to creating a safer and braver space in these gatherings where we are able to bring the truth of who we are and how we are doing. With all of this said, we proclaim that these conversations are meant to be an intentional step to live more fully into God's dream for us as the body of Christ. So again, welcome. We are so grateful for your presence and for choosing to gather in this space. And I think that our guest speakers will amplify how beautiful these types of gatherings can be. So today we are going to continue our discussion on creative approaches to innovative ministry as we hear from members of Common Ground Church, which is an ELCA congregation located in the great state of Wisconsin. Yay, go Wisconsin. Sorry, do you know where I live? Okay, now I've made myself lose my place. Okay, meeting in small groups, sharing meals, studying scripture, praying together, seeking God's invitation as to how they are being invited to loving and serving those around them. These are marks, of course, of discipleship and also ways that this community has taken very seriously the invitation from God. So, and it sounds, friends, like they are having an exciting time engaging this and leaning into this form of discipleship and being church together. So, friends, without further ado, it is our pleasure to welcome into the speaking space today leaders of Common Ground Church, Mike Gallmore and Pastor Michael Lee. We can't wait to have you lead us in a time of centering and to hear more of your story. Welcome to the space.
Fantastic. Thank you for having us. Mike is nodding his head, so I'm assuming.
Yep, I agree. Thank you for having us.
All right. I'm going to start with also just gratitude for our congregational lead initiative coach, Melissa Schroeder. Great to see you on this call. So grateful for her and her facilitation of amazing conversation and deep prayer. So honored to be a part of this group, this esteemed group. I am going to invite us into a time of quiet prayer and silent prayer, Lectio Divina, and a word about it before I begin the process. I was invited into this kind of prayer through one of my professors at Luther Seminary named Bill Smith, who taught spiritual care or pastoral care and counseling by rooting all of what he did in contemplative prayer, especially Lectio. And so this is from him. It's a version of what he did with me. And it also served Common Ground as well as our predecessor congregation, First Lutheran Church, in almost every single setting, including confirmation. And this one particular verse, especially during some of our transitional anxiety, served to ground and root us in calm in God. So I'm going to invite you into that. Is it okay if I share the screen, or can I do that? Okay, cool. Thank you. All righty. So I'm just going to put the visual. It's very basic, and it comes from Psalm 62. And I'm going to use a version of Lectio, so I'm going to read it through a couple of times, potentially three, and I'm going to invite you as you listen to think about how the psalmist in Psalm 1 says to meditate on God's word, that image of really relishing God's word. One of the images that Bill Smith gave us about that image is of a predator looking at its prey and its mouth salivating. And so he would say, maybe use think about your favorite lozenge and how it makes you salivate. And, there's something about the Word of God that the Holy Spirit uses to change us from the inside out. So I invite you into a quiet time. If you can root yourself, ground yourself by your feet being flat on the floor. If it helps to close your eyes, feel free to do that, or close your screen. Go ahead and do that. We're going to read through this slowly and invite you into this conversation with God and yourself and others, and remind you that maybe the first time through there will be some silence, and just imagine the word or image that comes to you, and then by the third time we might share a couple of those images. So I invite you into Psalm 62. For God alone, my soul waits in silence. From God comes my salvation. God alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall never be shaken. For God alone, my soul waits in silence, for my hope is from God. God alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be shaken. On God rest my deliverance and my honor. My mighty rock, my refuge is in God. So go ahead and just take some time, silence, and allow the Spirit of God to work in you, whatever you are needing in this time. Second reading. For God alone, my soul waits in silence. From God comes my salvation. God alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall never be shaken. For God alone, my soul waits in silence. For my hope is from God. God alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be shaken. On God rest my deliverance and my honor. My mighty rock, my refuge is in God. Be sure to breathe in your time of silence. Breathing in the Holy Spirit, the Ruach, the Pneuma. For God alone my soul waits in silence. From God comes my salvation. God alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall never be shaken. For God alone my soul waits in silence, for my hope is from God. God alone is my rock and my salvation, my fortress. I shall not be shaken. On God rests my deliverance and my honor. My mighty rock, my refuge is in God. Take a moment for final silence. Word or image emerges. Allow that spirit to work in you. Just take a moment and if your eyes are closed, open them up. Take a few deep breaths, slowly enter into the space, this time. And I invite, as the Spirit is moving in you, to share an image, a word, or a brief idea that you felt was speaking to you through this process, how the Spirit was moving in you. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I have to look and see if who all is here. If you want, how do you go about this?
However you would like. You can call on people, or they can just unmute or put in the chat.
Yeah, you can do that. You can put something in the chat if you would like, if that's more comfortable. You don't have to share. Ah, yes, God alone is my salvation. For God alone. Ah, image of a waterfall, water washing all things clean and flowing over the rocks in my path, beautiful and powerful. Hope is from God. God alone. Beautiful. Rock, hope, salvation, even though I still feel shaken. Thank you. My soul waits in silence. And the silence isn't lonely, it's full and hopeful. Thank you, Jen. Yeah. No matter what happens in my day, it's God alone who is with me, even as my soul waits and transitions. Hope, step 2 and 12 steps. Thank you, Tom. Awesome. Contrast and connection between idea of divine as refuge, fortress, and as flow. Nice. Thanks, Karen. Well, if there's others that want to share, you feel free to do that. And if the Spirit's still working on you and you feel like you would like to say something throughout the presentation, feel free to do that. And feel free to keep, I don't know what the rules are in this engagement, this conversation, how you engage, but feel free to interact the whole time. I'm good with that. I like a lot of moving parts. It's part of the reason why it's helpful for me to do Lexio before I present. I want to first let you know that we do have an outline for our conversation here today. Mike and I worked together a little bit on this, but have been talking together about this subject for at least the last 3.5 years, with many different groups or individuals, and a lot of times together. So that's not um, the group will testify. All right. I love that idea. Few rules. So I'm going to just turn it over to Mike, but let me just give you some basic outline. We're going to start with common ground and what we did in a really basic sense of that conversation, because common ground is a new congregation out of a historic congregation. So we'll talk about what we did, why we did what we did, and then we're going to speak into our approach, both on the run, on the fly, as well as very intentional stuff that we did, some learning about that, and then how it is rooted in who we are. So what, why, how, and who we are. And then I think you're going to have some time for conversation. So Mike, are you interested in starting? Would you be willing to do that? So Mike is our council president, and he served 3-year terms prior to this multiple times in our congregation. And then we became a new congregation, and it started all over for him. I think you're on your last year though, right? Your last term.
I'm not sure, but
Okay.
yes, I can definitely start. So what did we do? In 2020, as Pastor Mike said, we moved from the traditional historic church, First Lutheran Church, to common ground. We had many years of discussions about where God was leading us and where our future would be, but the official kind of transition happened in August of 2020. We were prepared to have that happen in spring of 2020, but something hit us out of the blue in spring of 2020 that threw a lot of our plans into new transition and new ways and new approaches. But in August of 2020, we went ahead, dissolved First Lutheran Church, and had started up Common Ground Church, and had the assets from First Lutheran went to Common Ground. You may ask, well, what changed? We purposely did that to kind of start fresh. We talked about kind of a new incarnation and that of our church, and we thought the best way would be to start fresh. So that was the what. So we started this, and one of the first items that we determined as part of Common Ground was that we did not need to necessarily hold on to and embrace our building. Our building was an aging, inaccessible item that was taking up a lot of time and energy. So we decided to put that up for sale, and then sold the building in early 2021, and have been meeting since then locally in small group settings, and kind of switched the focus of our ministry away from the building to other items. And I think that's some of the how that we'll talk about here shortly. So that's kind of the what. Is that what we were hoping to cover, Pastor Mike?
Yeah, and then just to add, to expand on what you said a little bit, microchurches in their really simple definitions are groups of 3 to 30 people. They are rooted in word, sacrament, and justice. The primary practices in each of these microchurches is community, worship, and mission. Actually starts with worship, community, and mission. And it does follow that triadic understanding of love God, love neighbor, make disciples. And you'll hear a little bit more about in the who, our values is rooted in that understanding. We moved basically from a centralized modality to a distributed modality. And there's more to it than just that. That's a technical kind of way of describing things. But if you want to say it in really short, quick terms, it's we dissolved, we disposed, and then we founded and where we were resurrected as something different. So yeah, let's talk about the how a little bit, or the why. Sorry, Mike, do you want to start or you want me to start?
Go ahead and start.
So the why for this transition, and Mike touched on it a little bit, really began as efficacy questions around the building. Was the building serving our sense of purpose and our context well? And so then it got into discernment, and we met with two building mission fund building consultants. Pat Dever was our first person that we met with, and then Jeffrey Spann, one in 2011 and one in 2005. And in both cases, we kind of came to the same conclusion, was that we would need to invest between $800,000 to $1 million in just renovating the building so that it would have less than seven, access points and seven different floors, basically different levels. And it really became for us an awareness piece. I'm kind of waking up to the fact that our facility at the time of First Lutheran's building, which was built on the same plot of land that the original building was built in 1906, but it was rebuilt and started over in about 1976. But the accessibility question came into focus as well as location. We're on a very steep hill. There were also questions of the use of funds. Is it good stewardship to refurbish what we already had so that it would be accessible, so that we can overcome some of the challenges of being built into a hill. And then it really turned into a question of our sense of call to the community. And we started asking questions of, who really does the building limit? In terms of connecting. If our mission is about the gospel and communicating gospel to our community and partnering with the community, who's being left out, basically inaccessible building, requiring them to forego participating in the life of our community. And it led us into conversations about, should we move? Should we stay? And we just said, it's not about staying in place or moving out of this place, but it's really about rooting ourselves more deeply in the place of Lodi, this location.
And I think both of those discussions, should we stay and renovate, or should we buy and establish a new building, still, while we're going through those discussions, we realized at some point that all of that is still inward looking. How do we get people to come to us rather than us being out in the community? So I don't think that happened overnight, but over time, because initially those were really the two options that we discussed: renovate or start new. And as we went through that discernment, we're like, but both, we really need to be in the community, out with people, in collaborating with each other, in with different people. So that really, and being accessible. And accessible isn't just how do we get them into our building, which was where our accessible question started, but are we accessible on Main Street? Are we accessible at the coffee house? Are we accessible at the basketball games or whatever in the community? So I think that was a huge, we learned, we didn't come in with that thought process, but over time that really became apparent to all of us.
Yeah, and just to again add a little bit to that is our sense of call to the community really drove uh, and our sense of ourselves. So vocation and context really had a lot to do with making this move, the why ultimately. We had become known over the course of 10 or so, 12 years as the church for the community. When you're complemented by some of our siblings in Christ in more conservative congregations, by their clergy and others, as gaining a reputation being for the community, something you really think about. It's like, oh yeah, what does that mean? It changes then how you sense your vocation. And it's like, okay, so what does that mean to be a church for the community, rather than trying to get the community into our church and reform them into our own image. And then also, what else was I guess that's enough said on that one. Right, Mike? Is that
Yep.
enough?
Yeah, that's good.
He's supposed to mess with his glasses to tell. Give me the signal, Mike. So now we're going to just talk about a little bit about the how, the approach. And these are some practical things that we did that really are, if you're into the adaptive versus technical leadership, um, start talking into or about the courageous collaboration. And by the way, the name or the title of courageous collaboration is something that came before the invitation. So it's kind of interesting. Um, and it grew out of just what really was our key posture. What is our key approach to being church in our community? And we really believe, based on feedback as well as our own, reflection, that collaboration around the Great Commandment is really our primary way of being with others. So, and so let's talk a little bit about the how. You first, let me just suggest to you the technical side of things. We had a wonderful attorney who is on retainer for our synod, who is very connected to the attorney who is on our attorney for the ELCA, and he's a part of a network of attorneys in the ELCA, and he was especially helpful through wading through something that doesn't happen very often, which was to dissolve, dispose, and refound a church at the same congregational vote. So during a pandemic.
During a pandemic, when we were doing the meeting virtually, but had to figure out a way to vote in person, we could probably do a 3-hour seminar on all of the things we learned through that. But I agree, the attorneys were very helpful to go throughout this. And I think the other, we brought our congregation and mission partners along with us every step of the way. We were having meetings, green lighting meetings, sharing what we were thinking, asking for input throughout the whole process. And we had our council and congregational leaders reading the Quietly Courageous book from Gil Rendell. And there's, if you have not read that, I would highly recommend it. But we modeled a lot of what we did from some of his thoughts and that. And then we actually used snippets of what he had shared to us in the book. We would then either have a sermon or a talking, like I presented a few different times after Sunday morning services on that. So it was, his book was really eye-opening as we went through the process.
Yeah. And that was through the year of 2019.
Yes.
But January, after the annual meeting into February, we were at a feeling of being stuck because we had already decided that we were going to seek out land and start fresh and build from there over a course. So find land first that's on flat ground, which is kind of challenging to do in our area. It's a very hilly region, and and that caused a little bit of a lot actually, transitional anxiety. Even after what 10 cottage meetings and green lighting, all that stuff, it still is a hard process. And by 2019, it was just clear that we had to do something different. So we had a council retreat. We did a lot of Lectio. We did a lot of centering prayer, a lot of discerning conversation at a cottage on a lake in Redstone Lake in Wisconsin, and we started reading that book, Quietly Courageous by Gil Rendell. One of the best books I've ever read in terms of framing the challenge, because he speaks into it's good leadership is not sufficient. You need creative or courageous leadership, and so I would highly recommend taking a look at that. The other approach, let me just give you a couple of other things, and you can ask more questions. I noticed that there was a question about accessibility. And I would agree with I think that's a great question. Accessible started out with physical handicap, but it really turned into neurodivergence, questions of generational differences. We had a program on Wednesday nights. It basically moved all our Sunday morning children's stuff to Wednesday nights, and we had over 100 people gathering, and about 50 of those kids that were there were coming from families that just had brand new experience with church or didn't have any experience with church. And so that was like, we started realizing church isn't very accessible. All the accoutrements that go along with church and its building and clergy centeredness and all that didn't make sense even, but silent prayer did, which is wild, you know. Contemplative prayer made sense, but a lot of the rules of, you know, forming people into churchy or church didn't make sense. So let me just give you a couple of things about our approach. And I'm just going to read a couple of these. For about 13 years, we did something of what I would call vocational attunement or attuning discernment around our vocation. And that included what I did up front with us all, with God, is attuning to God, self, and others. And so building it around the Great Commandment and the Great Commission. And it never got old. Maybe it did to the council. Maybe you can chime in there, Mike.
That was good.
We did a couple of practical things. We reversed the agenda. And so instead of waiting for or doing a quick devotion or prayer and then jumping right into the reports about finances and talking about money or how to fix a door with nobody who knows how to fix a door, or deal with real estate attorney types of things around our cemetery, you know, all that stuff leads us to frustration and agendas that never ever change. We just keep putting out fires or running to smoke where there's smoke, whether there's fire or not. And so we reversed the agenda. And what we decided, I don't know if it's decided or people are willing to go with the experiment. We started doing 20 to 30 minutes of contemplative prayer, of rooting, of grounding, and then discerning conversation around our vocation, our call from God. I also, as a part of the call process, wrote a reverse letter of call to the congregation council and congregation because I noticed that my letter of call as a clergy person looked more difficult than, you know, I don't know if Jesus could have fulfilled it. It was like, you know, walk on water, and the congregation council is like, you know, we'll support, or the congregation will offer up prayers and support. And I'm like, what? No, they won't. I'm not here. I don't need your prayers and support as much as I just, you know, we're in this together. So we reversed things, and we did that for a while. Mike, wouldn't you agree? I mean, we started having meals together. About half of our church council was in monthly spiritual direction. We actually called our spiritual care person, a staff person who's still on staff, who was a retired superintendent of schools. He also went through spiritual direction training through the Franciscan monastery in La Crosse. And so he got on staff, and so he was providing spiritual direction for the council. I went through spiritual director training and group settings, and so we really emphasized leadership from the inside out. We can have one without the other, but not one with, you know, like if we're all we're focusing in on is the outside, the shell of the organization and what we do and how we intersect with the community, and we're not developing our soul, we're going to find ourselves burned out and sometimes confused and trying a lot of different things without any sense of, you know, attunement with God. But if we only focus in on attunement with God and we're not focusing in on our neighbor and listening and deeply to them, we're going to be about just what happens inside our church. And we started asking one really practical way we did this, the how, was I heard a talk from Brian McLaren. Do you need to do something with the glasses? Do I need to get to the point here? I know. But Brian McLaren gave a talk on Everything Must Change, and we saw him at Willow Creek for a youth ministry conference in 2007, I think it was. And then he did some tour. He was at other churches, and he gave this illustration that I turned into like a little tool. And I would ask the question, when we asked this question over and over again, it was a part of the Doctorate of Ministry program through Garrett that I was a part of. We used that as the focal point for the intervention. And we would ask the question on the left, we draw 3 columns. And on the left-hand column, we'd ask the question, what keeps you up at night about your church? And typically it's, you know, pastor sermon length or money, decline, all that. And it's always been the same for over since 2007, since I've been using this. And then on the right-hand column, we would ask what keeps you up at night about your community or the world. And at that time, we had a fentanyl problem and an opioid problem in our community, homelessness, ecology, on and on, education. And and then we'd ask the question in the middle, I would ask the question, which list keeps you up more at night? And we would do that as a council. And then we would, even though we knew the steps, the first time is really powerful. People would mostly lean to the column about what keeps them up about their community or world. But the question then would be, which list keeps God up more at night? What gets us out of bed? Which list? Is it about what's going on in the context, our local context? Or is it about institutional self-preservation? Which most of our conversations at the council level prior to getting into this was really around institutional self-preservation. It was about when are we going to get more money? We got to, you can be both, by the way. You can be a constitutional expert and at the same time be deeply rooted in contemplative living and listening. It's not an either or zero-sum game. But we really needed to shift more in that listening to God. And that's what in my discovery was that the local church, and this gets to the who of who we are, at some point it just dawned on me that the local church sees itself in context, but oftentimes lacking a sense of collaborative energy. And it looks at the community or the creation there to serve, to provide resources to it. And instead of it being the local church is a creation, the local church is a creation for the creation. And that little sentence did so much for our community. We are a local church, but we are a creation of God for God's creation. And that switch then changes everything. That switch and rooting that idea and collaboration in the Great Commandment changed a lot too. It's like how do we attune ourselves to God's love, God's hopes for us, for the world, and how do we contextualize, because every call is a contextually conditioned call, right? If it's not, it's disconnected. So how do we listen to our neighbor and not other them? How do we incorporate our awareness that we belong to the very creation? We are the stuff of the very creation we seek to love and serve, and to listen to and see where God is working in them. So we did a lot on the vocational discernment and a lot of experimentation. Just an FYI, we did a ton of experimentation and learning. We failed at a lot of things, learned a lot. But the who question really came back to identifying that there's this automatic misapprehension of ourselves, our collective selves as humans, as Christian community, and then being caused by what, and for me, it was just this misattunement with God. And for us, the attuning experience of contemplative, calming prayer rooted us and helped us become more resonant chambers for God's love and compassion for others, and being able to maybe set aside or bracket the budget conversation until we really get clear on our call and what gets us up out of bed in the morning. So here's, I would say that's enough. Unless, Mike, you want to add more.
No, I mean, like you said, I said earlier, we could talk on a lot of these things for a long time. It's hard to keep it to a fairly concise set of things, but are there questions for us, or
are they going into groups, or what's the process?
Going to small groups, or?
Actually, I would love if y'all don't mind sharing, Jill, if you're okay with this. I feel like if you're willing to share one of your experiments that you consider a failure and what you learned from that, is that something you have? I feel like that's a lot of what we do in this space. That might be, I'm seeing some nodding heads. How does that feel for y'all to share one of those?
I'll share a fun one. Not fun for the kids that came up with the idea, but we did companion. They were called mission trips. I didn't call them mission trips. I wasn't very excited about that. It was obviously rooted in a colonial idea of, superiority, going somewhere with church center to the margins. But one of the I think it was Church Works, maybe it was called Youth Works. And yeah, John Potts, I think at the time was the leader, but they came up with like a contest for a grant. And so we, on the way back from this trip, it was, I think 2008 or something like that, they came up with the idea of loads of love. Let's help people with their laundry, especially those who are shut in or, can't get to, they have a difficult time carrying things. And so we won the contest. We got a $5,000 grant and we created all this marketing. We did everything. What we didn't do though? We didn't listen to people and their actual needs. So as soon as we offered it, people were like, we don't really want you touching our clothing. Like certain things are off limits. And basically no one bit on that idea. And that was like, okay. So we returned the $5,000. We took a hit on the marketing stuff and all that. And I don't know if you remember that, Mike, or not.
Yeah.
We used to do a night in Bethlehem. We used that through the local veterinary hospital. That was very successful, but then we tried to do something around Good Friday, Easter. We did it, and that failed very miserably. It was a one and done. We're like, we're not doing that again. There are other things. I would say there are some bigger things, I don't know if I'd call it failure as much as I don't know. I don't know what I'm still trying to make sense of 2015 to 16 when we had a task force, a future growth task force who came up with this idea of doing property or getting new property or discerning where we should be for a new facility. And we did we thought we did everything right. I mean, we had all these cottage gatherings, really thoughtful, a lot of input, and a lot of what we considered consent and like excitement and all that. And then all of a sudden we got into a really intense transitional conflict, and it was like, what could have we done better? And I think it took about 3 years of just doing really basic ministry, praying. I was in coaching and therapy. I was massage therapy. I tried everything. I mean, just to survive through that process, because it was difficult for us and the council and members. It was really difficult.
And all of this in a relatively small rural community. So when anything happens in any part of our community, the rest of the community knows about it fairly quickly. So that any type of conflict and things like that get blown up way out of proportion. So that added to it. So
we should write a book. At
yeah.
least, even if it's a messy, we should put something on paper so people can at least read it. We do have some videos out there that summarize some of this with different voices. The automatic misapprehension of self. So in my doctorate of ministry, I was just working on the problematic. And every time I did that activity where I asked people what keeps them up at night about their church, so we used to do what's called the missional discovery journey. And it was built around a 16 or 18 to 24-month process with local congregations, leadership coming together, and we would have plenary leadership. So I would do the missional leadership or missional church talk, and there was one on adaptive leadership, on discipleship, all this. And I was doing this activity with, what keeps you up at night about your church, and the majority, 99.9% of the conversation back to me on the whiteboard was, for them, critical junctures were around pastor's the problem, or membership, church membership. We need more young people. People don't appreciate the women of the ELCA anymore. Our daughters are not coming back. And it was just all around, and it was automatic. It was just like, oh man, nobody's saying people who are hungry or not being fed. Nobody said they're worried about their relationship to the local community, what happens with the school board. No one was talking about stuff about the earth. And it was just like, wow. And it just dawned on me. I'm like, that was automatic. Because obviously there's priming going on. And I'm asking them about their congregation, but nothing around vocation. And I believed a lot of what they were talking about was at this level of it's conflating some of the accoutrements of a centralized, historic, conventional church understanding, as a platform and with its vocation. So building is no longer a modality, it is now vocation because it occupies the majority of their conversation when they're at a council meeting. And it was for us. And so that automatic thing, and I didn't have a word for it in 2015 when I was doing my literature review, but I was very much into reading Daniel Siegel and all the neurobiological stuff. I didn't have the language for bias and the level that they did, but I was really emphasizing the neurobiological negativity bias, which there's multiple. Binkman, who is a clergy person, pastoral counselor kind of guy, and a few others. And I thought, oh yeah, that really makes more sense. And I'm like, so is there something else I could use? And then I started using the language of self-preservation bias. So self-preservation bias is built out of scarcity. It's out of the the negativity bias for survival and all that stuff. And I'm like, that's the automatic misapprehension of self. You
The
think
other part of that, Pastor Mike, that we talked about in somewhat, and this ties to Gil Rendell's book, was how much of that apprehension or misapprehension is tied to nostalgia. And
yeah,
so we've all heard, oh, if it could just be like it was when I was a kid or whatever. Nostalgia drives a lot of what we did in our church before going through this process. And I think a lot of the behaviors that you're describing, and I think I see that at other churches as well. So we had to try to get people to honor nostalgia, but then look into the future in ways that maybe that's not how we used to do it, and it probably won't be how we used to do it, and we got to be okay with that. And
right.
I like that. It robs us of God's new thing. That's totally what we were. Yeah, if you're just looking backwards, that's not very good leadership. And so Gil Rendell really, at least to me, that was a huge point of opening my eyes and trying to talk to the mission partners of nostalgia is good. It was good. We all remember how, the memories of when we were a kid and our confirmation classes or whatever, but it's a different world now. God's is leading us to new and different things.
Friends, I'm going to jump in very briefly. I don't want the room to turn on me that I'm interrupting your great presentation, because we already have requests for you to come back, and I won't put you on the spot now, but that invitation will be coming, and we hope that you do come back and continue this conversation, because it's impossible for this to be a one and done, friends. And
I apologize for that complexity about, there's more to it, right? There's a lot of variables.
Oh, no apologies.
Okay.
Jason and I love this because you are modeling for us exactly what we want courageous leaders to know. There are no one and dones in this. This is a template of continuous stepping into further and further into God's potential. Like we talk about that in our opening script, and you heard that today. We believe that this is one step into living into the beloved community, which is God's dream for us. And that certainly doesn't happen overnight. I want to make sure that there are two questions in the room that were posted in the chat. And if you have the opportunity to speak into those, one is our dear friend Jane Jokabek has said there were 3 columns. She missed the middle one. That may be a quick one to answer. And then another one that is a little more complicated, and that may be a fun one for us to kind of wrap on. Because we encourage people in the room that are hearing this to think about, how is what the speakers have presented, how is that changing your mental construct, right? What are some possible next steps that you will take because you heard these beautiful people speak today? But I love John's comment about how are lay people being equipped to run these house churches.
So there's this whole other conversation about discipleship and formation and leadership development. We went from no budget for adult discipleship and leadership development. Mike was on the church council at the time, and we were budgeting for 2006 when I came in there, and I said, there's no money in here, and we got the budget from last year and we added a little bit to it, right? That was the model. And but no change. And I said, I would like to add, was it 14,000 the first year?
I remember.
And then
Yeah.
it was 30,000.
Yeah.
And so our budget like completely flipped. Instead of putting a ton of money into the children's youth ministry, we flipped it and put it into the adult. And the thinking behind that was not because we would have little focus on the kids or children. No, we restarted a community-based day camp. I mean, we did so much. I mean, started a special Teens Encounter Christ for the Madison, Dane County area. I mean, just go on and on and on about the stuff we did with youth ministry, but it came out of the adult community. It wasn't sitting around asking kids, well, what do you want to do? And then, you know, go bowling, or let's do laser tag, or let's do, you know, let's make pizza and talk about what we should do. And instead it was just assuming that maybe kids had bigger questions, you know, like what was the burning question that they had. And so maybe we need to really focus in on the adult community. But we did a 2-year Bible study, intensive Bible study, like I said, spiritual direction. I started every confirmation night with Lectio, silent prayer. So the adults were a part of that formation. I expected groups, smaller groups. I mean, there was a lot of that going on. So discipleship wise, we're really struggling right now. And we've been a part of the Faithful Innovations. It's very similar to what we kind of cobbled together on our own. But we're really struggling in today's post-pandemic on what we're supposed to be doing. I don't know. I got to be honest. Discipleship is a really tough conversation. So how do we equip people for these microchurches? We're working that out. And I would say that the structure of the ELCA and its manifestation in local churches like ours has not caught up to where we're at with lay development. So we want to empower a interrelated, interdependent community where lay and clergy or roster leaders are colleagues by virtue of their baptism, and that the sacraments are not a magical, otherworldly requiring, you know, clergy, but that it is a common good of the whole community, and it's for the whole creation, and it's so it shouldn't be so complicated. Now, the thing we have to address though is, what if these micro churches that are word, sacrament, and justice, what if they're being led by somebody who turns out to be like a cult leader? You know, like how do you keep them accountable? Or what if they become, you know, forever Trumper MAGA types, you know, and they're like, they turn the group into a Christian nationalist group. You know, it's like, well, first of all, you can't completely control everything, you know, so you have to lean more into terms of permission, but then you work really hard with those leaders and you just basically set the expectation. There is no totally independent micro community. We're in this together, and we root ourselves in the same values of the ELCA. They used to have a values thing, and we said that every microchurch, this is, you consent to this kind of understanding of the Christian church and
And then
Christianity.
Pastor Mick, then the pastor's role becomes more of partnering and enabling each of those leaders rather than trying to reach 200, 500, 1,000 or whatever. They're, you know, it's a different type of model. And, you know, that by empowering the lay leaders, our intent is not to infringe and take anything away from the pastoral model, pastoral expertise. I mean, every one of our lay leaders in this situation will quickly tell you, well, I'm not ordained minister. I am not trained. I didn't go to seminary, you know, and you know, so nobody's trying to take the pastor's job or anything away. It's to try to be the arms and legs of pastors to reach more of our mission partners and interact and have more, you know, we've all been part of big groups. And when you're in a big group, and a group of 200 people in a room or in a classroom or whatever, who speaks? The person up front. When you're in a small group of 5, who speaks? Everybody, right? So that's kind of the model we're trying to get to.
And that's a beautiful spot for me to jump in and be the person in the front of the room and say, we are so grateful for this conversation. Michael and Mike, I hope that you can see the spirit that is stirring here on this subject. We do pray that you would consider coming back into this space. Jason and I will immediately be in conversation with you about the timing of that. So I think that there's some room for us to experiment and grow into. Friends, as we leave this space, again, huge thank yous to our speakers. This is a passionate subject and one that does take great courage. We applaud what Common Ground has done and the beautiful way that you share your story. Friends in the room, as we leave today, please know that you are seen, you are valued, and you indeed are loved. We can't wait to get together again next week. Lenten blessings to you. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
You all.